Hi guys, hope you're well. The reason I'm wearing my Obi-Wan Kenobi dressing gown is because it's absolutely freezing. I hope you're warmer than I am this week. Hope you enjoyed Psalm 103 last week. We had a great discussion about it, and this week we're on to Psalm number 22. I'm just going to give you a brief few comments about this, and similar to last week, I'm not going to tell you too much, but I'm going to just give you a little way to get under the surface of this one. So clearly we're dealing here with a lament and a complaint psalm. And first thing, a couple of comments. There's a title that says "To the Doe of the Dawn" in the ESV version, and that's probably just a particular tune or arrangement that they had at the time. And it's attributed again or written by or in the style of David. It could be any of those things. It doesn't necessarily mean it was written by David, or some people think that it actually was. And it's interesting because David obviously is the great shepherd king of Israel. And he was also a poet. He's clearly attributed as being a musician who wrote many songs. And his life was one of trust in God. It was one of great success and glory as Israel's great king. But it was also one of great failure and of suffering as well. So it helps the reader to imagine that David would have sung a lament like this when, for example, he was hiding from Saul, or when his own son Absalom had turned against him and he had to flee Jerusalem for a time. You can really imagine that David would have written a song like this. And it's probably for this reason the reader is being invited to imagine David as the one who's singing a lament like this. So it's helpful. So that's the title. When it comes to the psalm itself, when we get into it, one interesting thing to note, well, for me anyway, was that the changes in who the writer is addressing. So, particularly in the first half, he switches between addressing God and himself. It's almost as if the writer switches between a plea to God and then switches into meditating on all of his own woes. And we see this, and we see him switching from addressing God as you, predominantly, to addressing himself, speaking of me or my. So he's switching from the second person to the first person. And it's also interesting to note, and I'm going to highlight one verse, it's verse 11, where all the way up until this point you've had lines with two sentences or phrases. In verse 11 we have three. And there's a kind of emphasis there. It's a 3:: line, so there's three statements. And it stands in contrast to all those other lines, and it emphasizes the loneliness of the writer. He feels abandoned, and so this extra statement in verse 11, it's like an echo of his own voice, but no one else answering or nothing else there. There is no one to help. It's really sad. That colon, that really emphasizes that. So then, once he's done that, it's interesting to go, he has this you and me, second person, first person mix, and then from verse 12, he introduces a third person, other people, and that's his tormentors, they. And he begins to mix the first person, the second person, and the third person. He's seeing these people are, what he says about these people mixed in with his appeal to God and his reflection on his own woes there. And these tormentors are described in a particular way. I won't say too much about them, but see if you can discern any patterns, and it's worth reflecting on how they're presented and why the writer presents them this way. I'll just say, for example, you've got cows, lions, and dogs appearing more than once in the middle bit. And then there's the comments about parts of the body. He used them metaphorically in a very vivid kind of way. It's worth thinking about what's going on there. And then, once you're through this middle bit, it returns to the second person, you, and then sections which again are personal, my. But there's a change in the second half of the psalm. There's a new sense of perspective. There's an outwardness that you may have noticed. The writer's eyes have been lifted from his own suffering to something else. Another interesting feature of the second half is the question of who the writer is actually referring to. So is he talking about himself as the one who's been delivered by God, or is he talking about somebody else? Is he talking about any righteous sufferer? It could be any one of us. Or is he talking about a particular person? One whose suffering and deliverance is such good news that it causes us to praise God and to make this specific act of deliverance known. It's also worth noticing again the impact of that revelation for the writer. So just as we finish and connect to that, I'll just pose this final question. It's interesting how much of the psalm, particularly the first half, the writer is consumed with his own troubles. His only worry seems to be his own suffering and loneliness. And there's nothing wrong with this. I'm not saying that there isn't a valid reason to cry out for God, and we ourselves are encouraged to do that when we're feeling isolated, lonely, and tormented. Cry out to God. And there's a really wonderful way that the psalm puts those words into our mouth when we're feeling this way. But I will say that by the end, God's deliverance of the righteous sufferer, whoever he is, enables the writer to look far beyond his own sphere. And it's worth looking and thinking about how far beyond himself he's prompted to look, because it really is a wonderful encouragement. Hope you enjoy the psalm this week. Bye.